Welcome to Unit 2 of Photoshop Basics. This is the first lesson of Unit 2. I'm your instructor, Dan Hood. Today's lesson will be about the basic tools of Photoshop, namely the brushes tool, the fill tool, or otherwise known as the paint bucket tool, and the eraser tool. Your tool palette by default will always be on the left hand side of your window, and there are several tools in that palette. Today we'll talk about probably the three most basic and used tools of the tool palette. With these three tools you can really do a lot of different things with your images. You can really change them in a lot of different ways. The first one we'll start off with is the brushes tool, or the brush tool. The brush tool is right here, and as you can tell, one thing I like to point out is that when you hover over any of these tools, it will tell you what the tool name is and its shortcut key. So for instance, on the brush tool, as you see, it pops up and it says brush tool B. So to grab the brush tool quickly, all I would have to do is just press the B key, and as you can see, it highlighted the brush tool. Now another thing I'd like to point out in the tool palette is that on any brush or any tool where you see a very small triangle in the lower left hand corner of that tool, that means that there are other tools that are hidden underneath that tool, and they are all similar but do slightly different functions. So for instance, under the brush tool there are other tools, so the way to get to those tools is to click and hold that tool and you'll see the other tools pop up. So in this case you have the brush tool, the pencil tool, and the color replacement tool. So we're going to focus on the brush tool right now. So I'll click that. We are now on the brush tool, and I want to point out a few things, options for the brush tool that are available to you. As you can see along the top, under your just under your menu bar, are the different options for your brush tool. Here in this drop down, this is an option that shows you different types of brushes, different sizes, different shapes, the softness or hardness of a brush, and other options that are preset, predefined here. I probably have more than you will in your default application, your default Photoshop, because there are other brushes that are available out there that you can get from the internet and such and load them into Photoshop, and that's what I've done. So I probably have a lot more brushes in here than you would typically. So anyway, that is that option. Here, this is the brush size. Brush size is determined and is calculated by pixels. So here you have the diameter, and here you have the hardness. Now what that means is basically, if you would think about a real brush, say like an artist's brush, and about how hard or soft that brush is, how hard or soft the bristles are, and what kind of impression that would make on a canvas. So like if it had soft bristles, if you were to use that brush on the canvas, it would be a soft brush image on the canvas. The edges would be softer than a hard bristled brush. If you had a hard bristled brush, it would make a very hard impression and it wouldn't be soft around the edge. So that's one way to think of that. As you can see, here are some predetermined sizes and softnesses of brushes. Here's like 19 pixel hard, and you can tell it's hard because the circle, the diameter, is more solid looking as opposed to, say, the one below it, which is 27 pixels and a soft brush. And you can see if I click on that, the hardness of it goes down to 0. As here with this brush, the hardness is 100. 19 pixels, 100%. 27 pixels in diameter, 0% hardness. And I'll quickly show you what the difference is. If I choose this brush and come over here and paint on our image of the cowboy, you'll see it makes a very hard edge. Now if I were to go and to choose the 27 pixel brush, soft, round, it makes a softer edge. Very distinct images. Okay, so now the other option that we can look at is the mode. And this goes back to our layer modes that we were talking about earlier in the lesson about layers. Very similar in what we're seeing here. We're seeing darken, multiply, lighten, screen, all of the different layer modes. And what that does is that it applies that layer mode to your paintbrush. So let's say that I were to apply an overlay mode to my paintbrush. Now let's go get a large paintbrush so we can see this better. Let's get 100 size. That's a very large brush. And this is an 100 pixel diameter brush, very soft, with this overlay mode on top of it. And as you can see, it definitely has a different feel and effect when you paint with it. So that's how you can combine the modes with your brushes. So let's go ahead and we'll get rid of all of that. The last two things I want to talk to you about are about the opacity and the flow. These options are similar in the fact that opacity does exactly what we were talking about earlier. You can set the opacity level or the amount of transparency of that particular tool. So let's take that and we'll turn this down to 30%. And we'll get our brush. Let's turn off the overlay and go back to normal. And we'll brush along here. As you can see, it's very light. So that's where the opacity comes into play. Now if I were to click that back up to 100%, it's much darker. The same can be said for flow. Flow is very similar, and I'll show you what I mean. If I take flow and I turn it down to 18%, as you can see, it makes a lighter color. Now what the difference is that flow is determining the amount. If you were to think of this paintbrush in terms of the real world or like artistic paints, it would be the flow, the liquid consistency of that paintbrush. So imagine if you were to water down your paint to 18% of 100%, this is what it would look like. It would be kind of a watery feel to it. So let's say if I take it back, up to 62%, let's say, see it's a little darker, a little less watery. If you take it up to 100%, then obviously it's darker. So as I said, opacity and flow are very similar, but the difference to remember is that opacity is controlling the transparency of your paint, as flow is controlling the consistency of the paint. That's the difference. Okay, now that I've showed you the options across the top, now let's go back in and look at our different paint brushes itself. First of all, let's get rid of our painting here so we can go back to our original image. So let's choose the paintbrush tool again, and let's look at all of the different brushes that you have available on your paintbrush tool. Let's go to Window and go to Brushes, and that'll bring up the Brushes palette. Now, as you can see here, there are a number of different styles of brushes. Here we have the basic round brushes, either soft or hard. But then you have specialized brushes. Say, like for instance, you have the brush here that's actually more of a splatter type of brush. You have here, this is called chalk, and it gives you like a chalky feel, a chalky look. And as you can see at the bottom of this palette, it gives you a representation of what the brush is going to look like if you were to drag it across the screen and use it like a brush. So for instance, if I were here on this 17 pixel soft brush, that's what it would look like if I were to use it. Now, there are very specialized brushes also, which are nothing more than just shapes. So for instance, here there's a brush here that's called, I think, grass. Dune grass is what it's called. And as you can see, it can give you a very interesting effect by actually where you would be able to basically paint grass. Here you have a leaf, which I believe is that a maple leaf? Yes. And by using it, you would be able to paint leaves. You can also have stars. You have scattered leaves. And let me take one of these. I'm going to move this palette over here. And I'm going to take the maple leaf, and I'm just going to show you what it does. See how you're able to paint leaves? So, as I said, there are just almost infinite amount of brushes that you can use. Now, the thing is that these brushes, most of these brushes, these specialized brushes, are not part of the default application of Photoshop. If you go out to the internet and do searches for Photoshop brushes, you will come back with a number of hits of places that you can go and download brushes. If you wish to do that, the way that once you have your brushes downloaded to your computer, if you go here onto your brushes palette, go over to the upper right to where there's a small button. Click the button, and it has all these options, but the one that you're looking for is Load Brushes. And what that does is that it gives you the chance to load more brushes into your brush palette. What you would do is that you would navigate to wherever you keep your brushes. I don't have any extras right now, so I can't show you exactly how that's done, but you would navigate to wherever you keep your brushes, and you would click on them and you would load them. And then they would show up in your palette over here. As you can see, I have over time have loaded many different types of brushes into my brushes palette, so I can use them in different situations. Like, say for instance, there is this brush of a duck, actually. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. I'm going to take that up to 100 pixels so it'll be easier to see. And it's basically just painting the picture of a duck. So that's the brushes palette. I I think it would be a good idea for you to take the brush tool and just play with it. It's very powerful. You can do a lot of things with it. Say, for instance, a simple application of it is literally painting. So let's say that we wanted to paint our cowboy. He has kind of greenish eyes right now. Let's give him some blue eyes. So we're going to choose in our colors. We're going to choose a nice blue color. And let's zoom in on his eyes. Now, the way that you would do this is that you would use the paintbrush tool, choose a brush, and then with that color, let's take the opacity down to, say, 30%, and then let's paint onto his eyes. So now he has blue eyes. That is a basic and simple application of using the brush tool. And as you can see, now he has blue eyes. Okay, so now that we've showed some basics of the brush tool, let's go on to the paint bucket tool, which is right here, a few tools underneath the brush tool. And as you can see once again by the little triangle that there is another tool underneath there. You have the paintbrush tool, the paint bucket tool, the fill tool, I'm sorry, the fill tool or the paint bucket tool, and the gradient tool. The difference between these tools is that the paint bucket tool will fill an area with a solid color, while the gradient tool will fill an area with a gradient starting from one color going into another color. We're going to focus on the paint bucket tool. The paint bucket tool is simply a tool that will fill a large area quickly with color. And I'll just show you a very quick application of that. Say, for instance, I wanted to change the color back here. If I click in it, that's what it does. It changes that color very quickly. Now I'll show you some options here for controlling the paint bucket tool. And the options are, you have the paint bucket tool itself, you have the choice of using the foreground color, which is the blue color in this case, and this is the background color right now, the white, and you can choose the foreground or a pattern. And then here you have the mode, and this is going back to what we were talking about. You have the different modes, dark and multiply, that give you different special effects. Now here you have the opacity, just like with your paintbrush tool. Controls how opaque the color that you're applying is. And here you have what is called tolerance. Tolerance is basically a way of controlling how well your paintbrush or your paint bucket tool fills different areas. So, say if I had the paint bucket tool and I wanted to fill this area. With the tolerance, low tolerance starts at 0 and high tolerance goes to 100. As you can see here in this background color, there are a numerous different colors within the background. There's like this dark brown to the left, and it almost goes to a very, very light brown to the right, up against his cowboy hat. By choosing and controlling the tolerance, the paint bucket tool decides how wide of an area it will apply its paint. So say for instance, if I take the tolerance up to 100, it is going to be very tolerant of the wide variety of colors that it chooses to paint with. And I'll show you this by doing it. As you can see, that with its tolerance very high, it decided that it would paint its blue color into a wide variety of colors. So this is what happened. It not only chose to include the browns, but it chose to include a variety of other colors within the image. So let's go back and we'll take a look at the original image and I'll tell you what I'm talking about. So it chose to paint within the brown, some of the black, and to his skin. With that high tolerance of 100, it really was not very choosy of what colors to paint into. Now let's take that same tolerance level and let's knock it down to say 3. Now this time, if I click into this brown area, it's going to paint a very, very small area because its tolerance is so high that the colors it's going to paint into has to be of a very similar color. So let's show you what I mean. By clicking it, it only painted just this area because the tolerance level is so high. It chose this band of color, which is very similar in colors, brown, and filled it with the blue color. So that's an example of how to use the paint tool. By choosing a tolerance that is somewhere in the middle between 100 and 0, you get a nice setting of tolerances to where you can use it effectively. So let's take this to 50, and then I want to fill this blue. As you can see, it does a pretty good job of choosing just the background to paint blue. It looks like there I probably should change the tolerance down a little bit because it's trying to pick up a similar color in his beard that is also in this background. So let's take that down to say 20, see what that does. Okay, that's better. And there you go. By changing the tolerances and controlling the tolerances, you can quickly choose large areas to paint with. And that's how you use the paint bucket tool. Now the last tool that we'll talk about is the eraser tool. The eraser tool is a tool that is basically exactly what it says. It erases things. And as you can see, that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm erasing it to white. Now, as you can see, it's kind of giving me a soft edge as I erase. That is because I am erasing using a brush, if that makes sense. So basically what I'm doing is that I'm able to use brush the brush tool, but use it as an eraser. So here you have the eraser, and as you can see with the options up here, it has the eraser, it has the different brush size. Now the one thing that I'll point out here though is that right now if you see in mode, it has a brush, but then you can also use the pencil tool to erase with, or a simple block. And as you can see, using a simple block is exactly that. It is using a very hard-edged block to erase with. And that's exactly what it does. I mean, it erases very hard, but with a very hard edge, so you can really get in there and you can really erase very effectively with that block. So you have those three modes: the pencil, the block, or the brush. So if you go back to the brush, what it does is it gives you the options of choosing all of your different brushes. So if you have the 45 pixel soft, you will get this effect here. But let's say you go to the 19 hard and you come over here, and it's much more like using the block tool because it's a very hard edge. But that is an effective way of erasing out, say, backgrounds. So what I'm going to show you now, and the reason that the eraser tool is so useful, is just for that, erasing out backgrounds. There are many times in Photoshop where you want to take an image such as this and you want to erase the background around it and maybe place them in a different background. So the way that you would go about that, let's go back to our original image. The way that you would accomplish that is that, let's go back and we'll use something that we learned earlier in the layers lesson. The first thing you'll need to do, since this layer is the background layer and is locked and you can't do much to it except use your basic tools, what we'll need to do is we'll need to duplicate that. Now we have a duplicate of our background layer. Let's turn off our background layer, and now let's use the eraser tool. Let's use the brush tool, and we'll use let's use a larger brush because we don't want to take all day doing this. So let's use a 65 soft brush. And as you can see, I'm erasing out the background. My opacity is at 100, everything's at 100, so I want to completely erase out the background. And as you can see, I'm doing that. And let me point out something here. You have the checkerboard pattern back here. The checkerboard pattern is basically telling you that we are erasing out to a transparent background. Anytime you see the checkerboard back there, that means that is a transparency. So right now in this background there is nothing back there. Not even white. It is truly transparent. And I'll be able to show you that in detail as soon as I finish erasing my background. Now I'm going to do this quickly and probably not really cleanly, but this is just a sample of showing you how you can use the eraser tool. If I wanted to do this more cleanly, I would probably choose a harder brush and zoom in around the edges to get a better edge. Let me show you that real quick. So if I were to zoom in right there, that's his ear and that's his hat. See right now, as I'm using the eraser tool, it's giving me a pretty soft edge around the edge. If I wanted to give a better, cleaner, crisper edge, I would choose my eraser tool, but I would go with a harder tool, a harder brush, say, let's say the 19 pixel brush, but with a hard edge. And it is, as you can see, gives me a much harder edge and would give me a cleaner, crisper line as I'm erasing out backgrounds. See, a much crisper edge. And as you can really tell the difference from this edge to this edge. So let me just continue with this one, this tool, the hard edge brush eraser. And let me clean up the last bit of this. Okay, so now that I've erased my background, I'm going to show you, now that I've erased the background, how I can put a new background into this. So let's go, and we're going to open, or I'm sorry, we're going to go to Place, and we're going to place an image into this Photoshop document. We're going to grab one of our other images, the desert image, and we're going to place that into this image. And as you can see, it has been placed into this Photoshop document as its own layer, desert. Now it has the X box around it, and that means that it is not actually fully placed into the document until I double click on it. But what I want to do first is that I'm going to move this up, maybe even make it a little larger so it covers the whole background. And then I'm going to place it. Now right now it's above his face, but if I were to take this layer and put it behind him, then it does literally go behind him in the Photoshop document, and now it gives the appearance that he is now in the desert. And let me also point out, by using the eraser tool, as I was saying earlier about the soft edges, as you can see, there's a little bit of edge still left here from when I was using the eraser tool to erase out the background. Well, if I were to go back and use a harder brush, like I was showing earlier, I could really clean up this to look much crisper, much cleaner. As you can see. And that is our lesson today of the 3 tools: the paintbrush tool, the paint bucket tool, and the eraser tool. Thanks.